let me have an announcement first, and because coming Saturday we will have our India COVID relief fundraiser. So I thought that it's better to show them before to the audience, so that they can remember that coming Saturday is an important event for us. We have to collect some fund, and very much needed fund to send to India to all those people who need it. So poster is in the making, but the content is here. Danish Iqbal, a very good friend of ours and who is a regular feature, he will be conducting this event with Barkha, the famous journalist. These days she's writing a lot in New York Times and Washington Post, with our lead scientist, Dr. Shahid Jamil, and a very popular, respectable social scientist and activist, Dr. Sandeep Pandey, along with some medical doctors from India and USA. And they will be part of this fundraiser. So with this, let's move to today's event. And salam and namaste everyone, and welcome Professor Metcalf. It is our pleasure and honor to host you for today's event. And I have invited Dr. Mozam Siddiqui for a formal introduction about you and the theme. So Dr. Mozam Siddiqui, please go ahead.
So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce to you two very distinguished friends. Our speaker for today, Professor Barbara Metcalf, and her husband, Professor Tom Metcalf, and they are both uh, professors emeritus. And I had the good fortune of meeting Barbara in the fall of 1965 at UC Berkeley. And Barbara was my first Urdu student, and she was working on her PhD at that time and doing advanced Urdu, doing translations and readings and all that. And I also worked for Professor Tom Metcalf as his research assistant. He was working, among other things, on the uh, great zamindars, the talukadars of UP, and I was translating their diaries for him. And it gives me great pleasure, and I'm seeing them after a long time. And the last time I met Barbara was 10 years ago, but I have been keeping in touch in absentia, knowing about what she has been doing and all her activities and all that. So the topic for this afternoon is Nets and Networks, Islamic Scholarship in the Indian of the Raj, in the India of the Raj. And this is something which lately we have been hearing a lot about, especially Sashi Tharoor and others denigrating the presence of the Indian colonial system in India and all that. And for a change, we are going to hear about the soft side of the British Raj in India, and the tremendous influence that the British Raj had in India, especially when it comes to the area of Islamic studies, Islam in South Asia, and how some of the great institutions, religious institutions of India uh, uh, copied the model, the organizational model, and in some ways the curricula and all that of the British uh, higher education system. And Barbara Metcalf's groundbreaking work on the Deoband, Darul Uloom Deoband, and she worked on the first, I think, 40 years of the history of that institution. And I don't want to be too long. She has also worked on a very important groundbreaking book Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi's Behshti Zevar, translated that into English. And she, in co-authorship with her husband, they both wrote a concise history of India, of South Asia, uh, especially the colonial period, and the history of the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent. And with this brief introduction, I would like to introduce you to Professor Barbara Metcalf and welcome her uh, very with open arms to our present gathering. And over to you, Barbara.
Well, heartfelt thanks, Muslim, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here this morning. Um, I'm very honored to be asked to join your group for one of your sessions. And it is an extraordinary time when, and for any of us, let alone those of you with family and close associations with India, um, this is a terrible moment. Um, and so, we still will try to turn our attention to a subject I hope you will find interesting. Um, in fact, when Razi very kindly invited me to join, he particularly wanted me to speak during Ramzan, because it is an Islamic topic. So, as with everything else for Indians, this is a Ramzan like no other. And for those of you who are observing, I wish you a blessed month, now ending, a joyous Eve. Um, and Muslim is right that I have indeed been interested in uh, the colonial transition, but in actually a somewhat different way in my talk today. So let me turn to that. And I am the most remarkable thing. I thought on Thursday I should try to find out a little more about your group. So I went to the website and thought, well, I'll click on this last lecture by Jonathan Brown, whom I vaguely don't know personally. And it was a wonderful lecture. I don't know how many of you were there, but extremely interesting. And it also laid a foundation for what I wanted to talk about today. So, odd though the time is, it really seemed, you know, auspicious, let's say, that we should be talking one after the other. And I am, unlike him, I'm going to focus on a single individual. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. His name was Syed Sadiq Hassan, sometimes Sadiq Hassan Khan. And I think he opens up a range of topics in Islamic thought in the late colonial period, and also introduces a number of themes about colonialism. I'm really a historian. I mean, I'm not an Islamic studies person like Jonathan Brown. I mean, I introduce a colonial official. I probably have read as much about him as about Sadiq Hassan. So I'm more interested in kind of the pattern of his life. But let me just go on to say he really, really reinforces points that are not well known that Jonathan Brown was making. And the reason they're not well known is that he is basically a revisionist. He is changing what is the kind of received um, uh, understanding of flawed history, because he emphasized in the talk to you the vitality of Indian Islamic intellectual life. And if you weren't there, he had this great show and tell. He took his copies of a great intellectual biography called the Nusrat al-Khawatir, organized century-wise, and showed in particular how, as the centuries increased, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and so forth, they got bigger. And it was not only that distinguished scholars from India, the number was growing, but the quality as well. And his other point, that these scholars shaped Islamic thought transregionally. And the reason this is so important is that in multiple ways, historians are now working against one of the conventional tropes, themes of modern people, of places like Aligarh, actually, which is that culture, and not just Islamic culture, but culture generally in what we used to call the third world, was in a period of dark stagnation. And for Islamic thought, that's important because everyone's prepared to acknowledge the great classical period, but then everything dries up. And until you have the impact of the West, nothing is happening. So it's kind of this big bang theory of the impact of the West. And Indian modernists are part of disparaging this as well, that they're the ones who change. So the person that I want to talk about, Syed Sadiq Hassan, was in contrast part of an open-ended, vital, continually scholarly tradition, contextually sensitive, responsive to the changes of the era, but rooted in this continuing scholarship. And this is so interesting because it shatters, in particular, that dimension that has treated India in the Muslim world as peripheral. In the French university, if you studied Muslims anywhere outside the Middle East, it was called Islam périphérique. And what we learned from Jonathan Brown so eloquently, really, was the extent to which Indian scholars were experts for those farther west. And so I thank him for his talk. And for me, one of the most interesting part was his attentiveness to the 20th century scholars, some of whom I've worked on and written about, but in a very different way. But as he listed, actually, Deobandis from this particular sectarian orientation that is extremely influential, I've been working on, Maulana Muhammad Zakaria, Zafar Ahmed Osmani, Ashraf Ali Tanvi, Anwar Shah Kashmiri, Mufti Taqi Osmani, all of these. He talked about how today their works on Hadith and on Hanafi fiqh are influential across regions. So anyway, that's kind of a transition that, as I say, I have thanks to your earlier session. So let me turn to Sadiq Hassan. And I want to begin by sort of telling you the story of his biography, his life, and then more about this argument I'm making about his intellectual formation, his school of thought. Of course, one of the fundamental characteristics of, let's call it, modern Islam in South Asia is sectarian divisiveness. I've referred to the Deobandis, the people I've particularly worked on. He represents a much, particularly in the 19th century, minor position called the Ahle Hadith, the Hadith people. I want to talk about that. And then comes back to biography when a colonial official plays the Islamophobia card. So that's that. And then a very brief conclusion. So let me begin with the story of Syed Sadiq Hassan. He was born in 1832 in one of the little towns, the Qasbas of Awad, called Kanauj. And often, well, I won't talk about Qasbas, but his family was in some ways a typical Qasba family in having educational attainments, the men of the family educated as munshis, as the writers or secretaries with Persianate, Persian epistolary accounting skills, Persian norms, Persianate, some norms of behavior. His grandfather had been a very high-placed functionary in the princely state of Hyderabad. And it was a Shia family. Many had been part of the Lucknow court, which, if you know Lucknow, was a towering center of institutionalized Shia teachings and practice, very exuberant cultural life. So Siddiq Hassan's father walked out on the family, walked away from Shiism, and went to Delhi. And that's where, in some ways, our story is critically begins, because Delhi was one of those places that was part of this creative efflorescence in Islamic thought in the 18th century, across vast geographic stretches into Arabia, North Africa, West Africa, and so forth. And the central figure, who was also mentioned last time, was Shah Waliullah Muhaddis, who flourished in the mid-18th century. And again, picking up a theme, he was one of those scholars who was resident in the Hijaz. He was heir to the Hadith study. Abdul Muhaddis Dehlevi and others had been involved in a trans-regional study that had already established India, and that Shah Waliullah would take to a higher level as a major center of Hadith. And on those grounds, as were these other figures in the 18th century, he was a critic of society, of officialdom, of governance, of exploitation, very interesting, but also a critic of the way Islamic thought was not addressing legitimate behavior. He became a critic of many customs, deviant Shi'i and Sufi customs in particular. And he did this through his Hadith studies by rejecting a simple allegiance to the Hanafi, the dominant school of law, and instead moving more creatively among different legal traditions. And when Aulad Hassan, Siddiq Hassan's father, came to Delhi, by that time, in the early decades, we are now talking about a second and third generation of that family and scholars associated with it who were continuing that tradition. And by that time, also, the British were in control of the area. These major ulama had made peace with that and were not involved in militant activities, but there was a disciple, a scion of the family as well, who took leadership in a movement that went to the frontier to launch a jihad against the Sikh rulers of the Punjab, who they argued were oppressing Muslims. And that was what happened to Aulad Hassan. He went off there and got involved in this uprising, which crashed and burned very quickly. Had an enduring influence in texts that one of those scholars in particularly wrote, but that effort fizzled out, basically. And there we are. Aulad Hassan did not die. He came back, but did not live long after, left his widowed family and children impoverished. And at that point, his old colleagues, Aulad Hassan's old Delhi colleagues, stepped in to look after the education of the sons. And that is very illustrative of kind of the classic pattern of Islamic education. And he was obviously being trained, not obviously, but he was being trained so he could have gainful employment in this kind of Munshi skills, Persian. But he also acquired in his education a commitment to reformed Islamic jurisprudence and practice. And he was very smart, extremely good at languages, very quick, and set out the way people were educated in that day before we had formal institutions of the Deoband sort and before they became the norm. And he moved from scholar to scholar, from town to town. This is a child reading manuscripts. We don't have printed books in this period. We're talking about the late 1830s, the 1840s, and that was the way knowledge was passed on. In 1852, he reached Delhi and became a disciple of, that is to say, I don't know in what sense a disciple, a pupil, let's see, that's a more accurate word, of Mufti Sadruddin Khan Azurda, a very well-known poet and also a Ghazi who had risen as high as an Indian could go for the East India Company in Delhi. So it was he hosted poetic soiree, mehfil, and so forth. So it was a very heady atmosphere, I would imagine. And it was a period in which debates about Islam were part of the intellectual life, and all kinds of people were drawn into them. And there's actually a scholar at Berkeley now called Asad Q. Ahmed, who sort of founded work is in the great classical moments of Islamic scholarship, but has recently turned to India. And what he is arguing is, in a sense, people know, as we heard in Jonathan Brown, about the riches of Hadith study in India. But he is arguing that India, at this point, well into the mid-years of the 19th century, was also doing creative work in what are usually called the rational sciences, sciences like logic and philosophy, that stand in contrast to what is revealed, what is sacred. The Quran is the revealed. What is also sacred are the hadiths that communicate the prophetic norms, words and norms, behavior. And so the argument had been launched out of the Shah Waliullah school, particularly arguing that God was bound by no precedent, no law, that his power and unity could do things that were unthinkable, like lying or creating a prophet equivalent to Muhammad. And that argument, the ability argument versus the inability, continues as a fundamental divide in sectarian arguments today. It was a much more open argument in these years, not nearly as dug in as it is now. But Azurda was part of that debate. Ghalib, the greatest poet, I don't know, of Urdu ever, but certainly of the 19th century, was drawn in. And Ahmed argues that there were original and new dimensions in this debate, particularly delineating ethical implications of the respective positions. So it's a kind of a give you that little footnote about one more interesting thing happening in Islamic life in India. And that was the atmosphere that Sadiq Hassan experienced, and from which mid-1850s he set out to make his life. And even then, a princely state was a good place. Grandfather in Hyderabad, he went to Bhopal, another state that had Muslim rulers. But he had nothing. He was impoverished. He sold Ithr perfume that Kanauj actually was famous for, did some teaching, very humble role. But the state prime minister, who happened to also be part of reformist circles, picked him up, hired him as a clerk, low-level job. But even then, I think very telling about the personality of somebody who was extremely smart, increasingly convinced that he was right, and sometimes not as diplomatic as he might be, took on a senior cleric on the subject of the legitimacy of tobacco. And that fight cost him his job. And unfortunately, it cost him his job in 1857. So he got caught up in the mutiny. The family with someone who had been involved in a jihad was particularly vulnerable. There really was what you could call in parts of India a genocide against Muslims after the mutiny, brutal. And so he basically was at loose ends, picked up a job elsewhere briefly. But mercifully, from his point of view, in 1859, he was able to return to Bhopal, and which had been loyal during the mutiny, and now was in a position to offer a secure setting to attract refugees from the destroyed courts of Awadh, Lucknow, and Delhi. And this time he was hired, again, not a job of his dreams, but to write the state's history in Persian. This is something the British encouraged the princely states to do. So that was his initial job. But it was a foot in the door again, this time one that lasted. And things went well enough that this same prime minister arranged for Sadiq Hassan to marry his widowed daughter, 11 years his elder. Very dramatic reformist act, because as any of you know, in the late 19th century, particularly for respectable people, for widows to remarry was very unusual, but a core across religious traditions of a reform that was needed. And when he got to Bhopal, Sadiq Hassan became immersed in the tradition of a second luminosity of the long 18th century, the Yemeni scholar of law and hadith, Muhammad Ashokani. Little later than Shah Waliullah, but still part of that efflorescence. And Sadiq Hassan had encountered that before because of an Indian scholar called Abdul Haq Muhaddis Banarsi, with whom he had studied in Delhi. And again, it was the story we had heard from Jonathan Brown. Here was a scholar, gone on Hajj, remained, in his case, not so much in the Hijaz, but in the Arabian world, sat at Shawkani's feet in the 1820s. We're still in a world of manuscripts, copied his manuscripts, and returned to India to propagate, to develop his ideas. And Jamaluddin, the prime minister, was the same. He had not stayed in the Hijaz, but he had gone on Hajj, had met associates of Shawkani, and actually persuaded two brothers, extremely talented brothers, to come to Bhopal. And one of them rose to be the state Qazi and became the inseparable friend of Sadiq Hassan Khan, as a result of which he was, and Sadiq Hassan also received ijazas, these permissions to texts, of many texts of Shawkani from the brother, who was the main teacher. But from Zainul Abidin, the Qazi, who was his friend, he developed a kind of remarkable fluency in spoken Arabic, as well as textual skills. And then Sadiq Hassan himself went on Hajj, again in the classic style, used the occasion to copy manuscripts by hand, interact with Arab scholars, also interestingly, with members of the Indian diaspora in the Hijaz, which is a whole other story, because there are key people, including a couple actually of major people related to Deoband, who in this chaos after the mutiny of grim reprisals settled there. So that was a kind of other key moment for him. And so Sadiq Hassan now, with this terrific education, with access to these two strands of scholarship that were flourishing in sites in India as well, was very well positioned for an opportunity that would present itself, because in the early 1870s, the then ruler of Bhopal, the one under whose reign he had come, the then ruler of Bhopal, also a widowed woman, married him. Now, what I've actually been working on is a history of this lineage of women who ruled Bhopal, which in itself is quite a story. But we're going to leave that aside for the moment. But Shah Jahan Begum, who had ascended to the throne in 1868, widowed in 1871, married Sadiq Hassan. And why that matters is that he then had terrific resources, terrific power at his command at a time when the world had changed, when the stability of the Ottoman imperial network and the British imperial network made a kind of map for the movement of people and ideas and texts. And the texts in this period, from the 1870s on, dramatically moved from handwritten manuscripts to inexpensive print publications. And with his jagir of, I think it was 75,000 rupees a year, Sadiq Hassan Khan basically launched, I don't know, what would you call it? A think tank, an intellectual hothouse, bringing scholars to Bhopal, subsidizing them. He had people doing research, writing, preparing manuscripts for publication, manuscripts that fit this whole reformist kind of orientation. And the 75,000 rupees. So at this time, a teacher at Deoband was getting an income of 10, 12, if any at all, rupees a month, just to give you an idea of the scale. So that's it. Sadiq Hassan in this unusual setting with great resources. Now, his life was not easy. He had many enemies. The marriage was considered, say, by Shah Jahan's grandmother, who had been the first woman in power, a total scandal. It was Shah Jahan's choice, not a family choice, which no respectable woman would do. He was not a Pathan. This was a Pathan family. He ought to have been, in fact, a relative. And he was an upstart. He was impoverished. He was nobody. And the marriage, she was still in her 30s. If she had had a son, it would have upset succession because her daughter from her first marriage was the heir apparent. And so he was in a tricky situation, but it, in a way, was able to control it by the power he had and was able to find an outlet that would secure him, if you will, prestige, a world of his own, and respect through this kind of work and publication. So now he himself is approaching 40, and it comes into a time which is really his halcyon moment of productivity. And it's very interesting that he would become a major reformer. I mean, reform was everywhere in those years. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, organizing schools, Anjuman associations, publishing, public gatherings, debates. And he had the intellectual background to be part of that change. But as an Islamic reformer, someone really focused on the content of Islamic thought, he was the wrong kind of person, because one of the targets was the Nawabi lifestyle. And here he was relishing his life as a prince consort. The indulgent, lavish life of aristocrats was held up as a counter to what these other reform movements espoused, which was sober, practical, disciplined life. So that in itself is kind of interesting. I think there's more to say about it, but that just keep that in mind, how unusual it is. If you know the novels of Nazir Ahmed, the Urdu novels, the Tawbat un-Nasuh, the renegade son who refused to be reformed, goes off to a princely court. And it is in the princely court with the books of poetry and the indulgent lifestyle as it's understood. It's that becomes a target for the kind of bourgeois life that reformers now are propagating. But it did give him, as I said, the resources to undertake this huge era in a period and to disseminate publications in what is sometimes called the first era of globalization, of steam and print. And this was, as I say, sort of his peak. So let me turn now to kind of the second part of what I want to talk about, which is what is distinctive about the Ahl Hadith position. So there was what could almost be called a generic package of reform. And many of these were shared by Hindu reformers as well. Things I've already mentioned: the prudence, the discipline, the avoidance of lavish life cycle ceremonies, a shared concern with girls and women, favoring some level of girls' education, an end to child marriage, widow remarriage. And then there are Islam-specific reforms. Now, I might say that everyone, including oligarch thinkers, Nazir Ahmed is roughly in that, favored seclusion, parda. But what they did include were these questions that I already mentioned in relation to Shah Wali Ullah, excess veneration of Sufis in their shrines, superstitious amulets, Shi'i devotions, anything that seemed to compromise Tawheed, divine unity. And the Ahl Hadith, this particular, increasingly recognized as a named Muslak sectarian, denominational definition here, what defined them was their jurisprudential position. And that was a rejection of adherence to a single law school, taqlid, which in India meant for most Muslims, the Hanafi legal tradition. And on those grounds, the Ahl Hadith differed from Hanafis on specific points of ritual and family law. And probably the most inflammatory, which led to lawsuits over mosque control, was their form of the canonical prayer, position of the hands, saying Amin out loud, things like that. And they differed over some issues related to women that from today's perspective seem progressive. They were flat out in rejecting what is called triple talaq, instant divorce. You say I divorce you a man says I divorce you 3 times, for them it counted as 1. They were much less concerned with pollution issues about menstruation, probably the single biggest worldwide taboo. And you know, if you follow things in India, how that has been a big issue for Hindus as well, in excluding them from temples. And in fact, the Ahl Hadith recognized the legitimacy of women's presence in mosques and idgahs. And Shah Jahan Begum built this huge mosque in Bhopal. It's actually quite famous, the Taj al-Masajid, the biggest mosque in India, had column aisles, I guess you call them, on the side. The women weren't at the back, they were along the sides. And her Eidgah in the north of the city had trees, hedges planted that again formed a column for women. So it's kind of interesting. How much is translated into actual practice? Not at all clear. Certainly the mosque is not used that way today, or when I was most recently there. So the Hadiths are the Hadith people. And what that meant, they said, was that they were the real Hanafis, the real imitators of Abu Hanifa, who, like them, sought guidance by direct engagement with the revealed text of the Quran and the sound sayings and practices of what the Prophet Muhammad said and did, his sunnah. And knowing which were sound hadith and which were not, and knowing their appropriate relevance, was the exercise of a scholar like Sadiq Hassan. And for this orientation, Ashkani's thought was very opposite. Shah Waliullah opened up the Hanafi school, you could say, but he was basically tilted in that direction. And certainly Sadiq Hassan incorporated much of the thought of his tradition. But Shawkani could not be associated with any law school. And what was interesting in his case is, in a sense, like the Indian reformers, in principle, his quest was unity. And in his case, he made use of Hadith traditions acceptable to the Zedi Shia of the Yemeni highlands, as well as for Sunni scholars. So that in itself, I think, is very interesting for people like Jamaluddin and Sadiq Hassan, who come out of the Shia world of Awad. And for them too, you might, and this is speculation, might not the abandonment of a Sunni law school allow the achievement of the elusive goal of unity with the Shia. So that's one reason it's, as I say, it's a kind of appealing law school. And then secondly, Shawkani dramatically narrowed the use of jurisprudential principles that could be extended over ever-widening domains because of the classical pillars, the usul fiqh. He opposed the application of reason and analogy. He opposed qiyas, rai, aql, and another pillar, the classical principle of ijma, or consensus. Whose consensus would it be? How do you judge consensus? And with that, if you move to what is literally enjoined, you are in a position for much higher potential, the assumption would be, for agreement. And for Shawkani, this meant most of his teaching were on ritual law, not even on other law entailing human transaction. There's this great quote from him: "Why enlarge the scope of the believer's duties, which is only increasing their burden?" And this made effectively for a de facto separation between governance and religious or moral guidance, which is exactly what the British colonial regime wanted to have. So in that sense, I'm saying very opposite to the moment in many ways. So here is Sadiq Hassan Khan publishing in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, many goals. I mean, in Persian, he's publishing poetry, major tazkira of Persian poetry. The last great tazkiras come from Bhopal, not from Qajar, Iran, from Bhopal. So that's another story, the Persian world of India. He wrote a travel account, did a lot of stuff on biography. It's so important if you're doing Hadith transmission, because you have to be able to account for the transmitters, and many Arabic commentaries and studies of Hadith. He got major texts published, including al-Bukhari, a commentary called the Fath al-Bari, works by Ibn Taymiyyah, and Shawkani. He was a master of many scholarly disciplines that are related to lexicography and philology, all essential to recognizing texts authentic to the Prophet's day. And I think I probably can't talk in as much detail as I would love to about some of these texts, but let me just mention a couple. In Arabic, he wrote wrote many commentaries. And of course, one of the and again, Jonathan Brown set the stage for that. Oh, an abridgment, a commentary, how pedestrian. No, the whole point is that the commentarial tradition was the key way that you introduce a new perspective, in which you introduce relevance for the moment. So, okay, so this Bulga. So here's a text. What could this have to do with anything? This is a book from the 15th century, Suyuti, lexicography, philology. But this is critical if you are involved in translating Arabic classics into Urdu, which he was doing, including the Quran. And he would go to Suyuti for the kinds of issues about vocabulary. And for me, I heard a lecture just this past week on Marathi in this period by a woman called Prachi Deshpande. She was talking about how, this is a period when the regional languages are moving into much more prose publication. And among other things, both in Marathi and Bengali, there are people who are purging these languages of what they see as foreign elements: Persian, Urdu, English. Meanwhile, here is Sadiq Hassan. And as he writes on Suyuti, he comments on Urdu and says, among other things, that the strength of vernacular Urdu is its range of resources, Sanskrit, Persian in particular, but all kinds of inclusiveness. And he also emphasizes the beauty of the language, the sheer pleasure of the beauty of Urdu in poetry and every kind of literature. And partly because Urdu is such a remarkable language, this is part of the talk is in honor of Muazzam, he insisted on the possibility of Quranic translation. So I'm not going to talk about his he did a commentary himself. Tarjuman al-Quran, a translation, is always called a commentary for the Quran. And this was absolutely key to the kind of reform that Islamic thinkers were doing in this period, putting into readers' hands accessible Urdu translations and commentaries. But he also wrote books that were much more geared, and again, some of them were commentaries that become relevant because of the specific local customs and behavior that he targeted. And I have here in my presentation, I gave as an example one written in Persian, just a reminder how widespread Persian was as a language of people like him. So who was the audience? As I've already mentioned, British imperial connections overlapped with Ottoman ones that facilitated the spread of his texts. An example of a long distance trader Arab trader he was in cotton goods based in Mecca, who in the 1870s began facilitating the shipment of his publications through these cotton mercantile networks into the Ottoman lands. A whole other story is the extent to which participants in what was called the Nada, the Renaissance of Arabic literature. And here too, there is a kind of revisionist history, which has always been attributed to Arab intellectuals knowing French and German literature and changing Arabic, and maybe reviving dead classical Arabic. No, part of what they are doing is tapping into this living tradition of Arabic literature, including Sadiq Hassan's writings. So there is a Arabic publishing house in Istanbul in the 1870s, 80s, pick up a dozen of his titles, including the Bulga that I mentioned, and they are published for this kind of an audience. His vernacular readers were in army barracks in Bengal and Madras, in trading houses in Bombay, along trade routes into the Northwest. There was a Lahore voluntary organization, an Anjuman, an Ahl Hadith Anjuman, made up of traders, officials, secular teachers, contractors, lawyers. Now, these were the people who would have read Urdu. it would have mattered. They knew that he did Arabic. That gave him authenticity. And why did people turn to them? Some mixture, reassurance of access to authentic practice, community that came from shared practice. And remember how I describe these people? Many of these people who had been uprooted, army, trade. So in a context of geographic and social mobility, this is unity. And the Hajjaj, this last Persian book, is really about the end times, sign of the end times, of which one is deviance from correct behavior. Because the Alayadis were one of those many movements in this period, like the Ahmadiyya, that predicted that the end was near. So these are, so you want to be on the right side. You want authentic practice. And there's another kind of worldly reason that these were appealing. To follow this kind of behavior came with greater respectability. It was poor people who didn't know better, who spent their time asking for intercession at Sufi shrines, that kind of thing would be the argument. So one might readily imagine why he had an appeal, his readings. So finally, let me talk about his appeal, about what happened to him. What happened? In the mid-1880s, Leopold Griffin, the agent to the Governor General for General India, the most powerful colonial figure, cried jihad to describe his international connections and Oriental despotism to describe his governance. False stereotypes, Islamophobia. And Griffin is an extraordinarily interesting person. He settled the war in Afghanistan. He wanted to be governor of Punjab. Instead, he got Bhopal or Central India as second place. And he was as smart and probably arrogant as Sadiq Hassan. And in the Bhopal court, he wanted to be himself, not Sadiq Hassan, who, as he saw it, told the Begum what to do. He was incensed over Parda. Now, the other earlier women in the dynasty, and in fact, Shah Jahan Begum, before she was married, had not been secluded. She was a horsewoman. She did sports. They were out and about. Now, she veiled, which is a kind of power. She could see him. He couldn't see her. He hated it. It drove him crazy. And others, colonial officials, adjusted. He made it a huge cause. And he loathed Sadiq Hassan, effete, suspicious intellectual. If there had to be a Muslim ruler, let it be a tough and martial Pathan. He had very racist ideas of whom, the British had these theories of martial races, who could do this, who could do that. So he set out to remove Sadiq Hassan from power, had agents collecting his books at ports, sent a Punjabi spy to investigate his booksellers. He had someone misreading the books. I mean, he didn't tell them to misread, but I've seen the documents in London. So what he saw as an uprising were really descriptions of the Day of Judgment. And he threw in corruption. He wanted Sadiq Hassan put to death or at best banished. There's a wonderful article by a scholar at Reckles on phantom Wahhabis, taking the name from the militant Arab reforms. And so Sadiq Hassan became a phantom Wahhabi. This is a period when officials, 1880s, thought Muslim, it's so interesting for our times, saw jihad everywhere. From the Sudan, where the Mehdi was there, from the always dangerous Hijaz. Shah Jahan Begum was iron, steel backbone. She fought tenaciously. And all she could get was at least Sadiq Hassan wasn't killed. He was sidelined. And so I talked about net and networks. Here's my net, the butterfly net of how easy it is to have recourse to Islamic stereotypes. Put under house arrest, stripped of his honors, no longer Nawab Sadiq Hassan, no 17-gun salute, no activity beyond the state. His networks were shut down. And, you know, people, they say, die of a broken heart. He simply withered. And he was still quite young and died in 1890. How ironic to accuse him of sedition. The British princely regime made him what he was. He had every reason to support that. And his stance, the LAD stance, mapped perfectly onto the colonial definition of religion. And it was one internalized by the ulama generally in the late colonial period, would be the stance that Indian ulama carry into the present. And Indian Muslims generally are the most eloquent defenders still standing of the Indian Constitution. So Sadiq Hassan turned to his usual tool. He wrote a book, the Tarjuman-e-Wahhabiya, showing precisely why he was not a Wahhabi, pointing out all the differences in what he stood for, showing his opposition to jihad and so forth. Great irony. So the LADs are, you know, another, I have to leave it at that. But let me just say that we learn a lot about colonialism from the princely states, including the draconianism of racist power behind a facade of friendship. Sadiq Hassan did not have his day in court. So I have really, I know I must wind up, a very quick conclusion of two counterfactuals. Now, okay, this is really a throwaway conclusion, but I can't resist. Major study of the multiple centers of Islamic reform in the 18th century I actually pulled out the book to show you, fabulously interesting book by Ahmed Dalal that puts a new angle on this. His title, as you can see, is Islam Without Europe. Dalal argues that these intellectual movements flourished precisely before European encounters, which derailed them. So the counterfactual is to specialize what would have happened if the creative rethinking of jurisprudence, political, cultural, everyday in life had not been stultified or derailed into political ideologies like Islamism. That's my Black Panther counterfactualism, if you saw that movie. Utopia without colonialism. And my second counterfactual, the foreignness of Islam in India is a familiar trope in majoritarian Hindu nationalist rhetoric. I don't have to tell you that. India is the land of Hindus, and the violence of that ideology is too much with us. The use of history in public life, which Jonathan Brown also reminded us of, distorts the way all of Indian history is told, like the shape of the Mahmud Ghazni story, poisonous history. Now, a classic liberal response is to say Muslims are native, descended from the same stock. That's actually true. Sharing cultural forms, that's also true in what is called syncretism. But it's not, first of all, it's not exactly right in the way it's usually packaged, to the extent that which I would say both approaches are bad history. And here's my counterfact. Imagine we had good history. And if we did, that history would tell the story of the substantial accomplishments of a trans-regional Islamic intellectual like Sadiq Hassan and many, many others, as you heard last time. Over the centuries, people recognized beyond India's borders as major figures. I think of, I don't know if any of you are Biharis, but the philanthropist Khuda Bakhsh, who hoped that his incomparable library in Patna, with manuscript treasures, would be a source of pride not only for his maligned hometown, always struggling in Calcutta's shadow, but for Indians of every background. For Khuda Bakhsh's vision of Islamic achievements to be an integral part of India's national history, alas, seems for the moment more likely to happen in a movie than in India's tragic public life. That's my end.
Wonderful lecture. And I think at the end, what you concluded is what we are facing at this moment. Anybody writing good history in India is labeled as writing a wrong history about India. You know, people are targeted, like, you know, Romila Thapar and others were targeted, that writing a wrong history of India where Muslims must be put into a darker, you know, image, or foreigners or savages and all those. So there is always a campaign, and there are always people who are trying to correct it. And so this struggle is going on in present day majoritarian India, which is at the very much in conflict with the Nehruvian secular India or the liberal India. So that's what we are facing. Thank you very much. And probably people will ask some questions. It was basically on a one-person story and about its impact. So the floor is open, and if Dr. Rafat Hussain is here, probably he can take over to ask, moderate this session. And if he's not, then people are free to ask questions. Please.
No, I am here. So,
okay. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara Metcalf. It was a wonderful learning lecture, at least for me. I'm not that religious, but I still learned a lot of new things. So there are two options to ask the question. One is you can raise your digital hand, or you can put your request in a chat box and say, I do have a question. So I already have 3 digital hands raised. First one is Abdul Jabbar, next is Faisal Beg, and Tariq Farooqi. So Abdul Jabbar, please go ahead. Unmute yourself. Jabbar Saab.
Now it's fine. Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you for taking the time as a Professor Metcalf. Like Faisal, this is something new to me as a bigger scientist. So so I try to learn. So my question is what impact the Mughal Empire, because we hear about the Islam as in India as well as a prophet time. So what influence the Mughal period did to the kind of for the intellectual growth of Islam in India? That's the history in the kind of continuum of historical.
I think what I would say to that is that the Mughal Empire, like the Turco-Afghan empires that preceded it, right? Because we have Turks and Afghans who are dominant in large areas of the country before the Chugtai Mongol Empire comes in. What all of these empires did, above all, was to create cosmopolitan centers of patronage. And what that meant is that people were able to write, to engage in all kinds of literary and intellectual activities, of which these were among them. And there were political figures who themselves were deeply interested in, kind of advanced intellectual studies. We heard about Dara Shukla last night. Abdur Rahman, whose tomb is near Humayun's tomb, is another great intellectual patron of writing. And it is in the Mughal period that Hinduism as well basically takes the shape that we know. You would never have had the Tulsidas Ramayana if there had not been the Persian Musnavi tradition of writing. Sanskrit, this is a whole new world in which Sanskrit and Persian are being studied by scholars simultaneously. And a few of the people who are doing that, Audrey Truchka at Rutgers, Supriya Gandhi with her new book on Dara Shukko, the very, very rich area. And I think that is part of the legacy. We talked about Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi in the 16th century, Akbar period, who is really, you understand the history of Hadith scholarship in India. He is critical. And these are people who are patronized in this very rich and vibrant cosmopolitan world. I think that's, well, and some things directly sponsored by the state, like the Fatwa Alamgiri. So I think it's that level of patronage and the fact that the courts are plural courts. These are dynamic and creative. It's very, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Metcalf. Next person is Faisal Beg, please unmute yourself. Faisal Beg, sir. Okay, we will come back to him.
No, I have unmuted. So just one moment, if I can ask the question right now.
Sure, go ahead.
So thank you, Professor Metcalf. I think I'm sitting in Delhi, and I think listening to this presentation is so fascinating. Actually, it's like passing through that phase of history of 18th, 19th century. I think I found this extremely enlightening, and I'm so grateful to you. I have 2 points actually. It's not really questions, but and I think you wove a wonderful story actually around one individual. I think you told so many things about gender, about I think this think tank tradition, knowledge, the transitions, and moving people from one place to another, etc. My question is, when so much was happening in Bhopal, what was the replication of these efforts in other parts of India, maybe Hyderabad, maybe Lucknow, and elsewhere? So that's one question. I think you referred to Khuda Bakhsh Library in Patna, so I'm sure there was something happening at that end. My second point is about the intersection of such reformist efforts in an intercultural and interreligious context. I think you referred briefly to Sikh reforms and Hindu reforms. Can you elaborate a little more in terms of, like, while there was so much of robustness happening in Bhopal, what was happening in other religions, in other cultural contexts elsewhere? Thank you.
The question about the other centers of activity is a very interesting question, because primarily intellectual activities in this period of the late 19th century had shifted to the Qasbah, to these country towns that often had established Muslim families known for their learning, for their what should we call it, spirituality. I mean, that's a funny word, but you know what I mean, part of the great Sufi lineages. And so when I did my project on Deoband, that was a project about Deoband itself, about Kandala, about Saharanpur. Saharanpur is a bigger city now, but these are the towns outside the major administrative, political, commercial centers, towns that had cultural resources, but were were in these other places. And they depended much more on grassroots support than on patronage from above. Now, I say grassroots, they would have had some rich people who contributed to them, but it wasn't the same kind of situation of court patronage. So that's one answer that I would have. As for other religions, what we're really talking about are, when I refer to Hinduism and the kind of shared program on such issues as girls' education, ending child marriage, widow remarriage. The minute I say these words, you'll remember the Brahmo Samaj, Ram Mohan Roy, the Arya Samaj, and people who weren't particularly associated with those organizations, but that were in the forefront, many of them for Hindus coming initially out of Calcutta. That was the great hot, of course, the Arya Samaj was Punjab, but these many intellectuals who come from that part of the world.
Thank you, Tariq Farooqi sir.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. My question is based on the fact that you're a historian and how you see current political events. You see in America, the mismanagement of the pandemic got rid of Donald Trump, although unfortunately Trumpism still remains. How do you see the same mismanagement playing out in India regarding the current Hindutva politics?
Well, people who know much more than I do are talking about that. And, you know, I've seen articles that really talk about the fact that Modi is excused, that this is not going to be the end for him. And remember, here it is by a hair's breadth, really, that Biden is able. He may have won 7 million more votes, but because of our electoral college system, very close. And without the miracle of Georgia, he could not be making changes much at all, could he? So I don't know. I mean, I bet every single person here has an opinion on that probably has more value than mine. But God knows there needs to be change.
Thank you, Dr. Muazzam Saab. And then Shanti. Muazzam Saab, please.
Thank you, Barbara, for your excellent presentation. So I have a question. You have written a book on Hussein Mcmudney, the jihad for Islam and for India's freedom. So what is the relevance? Of course, I'm not talking about the present regime, but overall relevance of Hussein Mcmudney that, you know, because I know Abul Kalam Azad kind of overshadowed Hussein Mcmudney. And the reason I'm interested in Hussein Mcmudney is Allama Iqbal's take on Hussein Mcmudney is very interesting. And he has written a book, a poem also referring to him.
Yes, he has.
Right. So what is the relevance of Hussein Mcmudney in the overall freedom struggle for India?
Well, as you said, I've written a book about it. So I have to say, don't get me started. But I think he is so underappreciated and so interesting. And he was, by the way, a brilliant scholar of Hadith. I mean, students memorized what he said. They sat at his feet. So that he comes out of that great intellectual tradition. That's the first thing. Iqbal was an amateur when it came to religious stuff.
Right.
Great poet, but an amateur. Okay, so what I would say about Hussein Mcmudney is he was so shrewd and had such a brilliant read on Indian politics compared, for example, to Jinnah. He had been involved marginally in what was called the Silk Letter conspiracy. He's living in Medina. His father, also from Eastern UP, had gone to Medina during one of those people in the colonial period who went and lived in the Hijaz. And that was where he developed his skills. But then he is picked up and sent off to Malta as a prisoner during World War I and meets the Ottomans. And so he has he is so right. You know, he knew that the European powers' plan after the war, although it masqueraded as a protectorate, were really dividing up the Middle East as spheres of influence, destroying the Ottoman Empire as spheres of influence. Now, maybe he underestimated nationalism, but he saw what the British were doing as parallel, that by dividing India, by supporting Pakistan, they were making India weaker and they could get involved. And of course, that is exactly what happened, with Pakistan becoming an ally in every Western alliance from then on and becoming a surrogate for, or whatever you call it, for particularly, in this case, American military event. He also was unbelievably astute on the flaw in imagining an Islamic state or a Muslim, first of all, a Muslim state. How can you uproot a population that is so embedded, that is scattered all over the country? And of course, he was right. But more to the point, if it's not a Muslim state, but an Islamic state, when you have a religion that is this divided, what can you legislate that will not produce dissent? It's nothing people will agree on. And the only way you can do it is if you become authoritarian. And that is out of sync with the world we live in which governments have to operate by you know, kind of not, what am I saying? By popular support. That is the form of government. So he was very, very astute. That's my opinion. He favored what to a liberal is still problematic, and that is a major role for the ulama in the religious guidance of people. But as long as that's optional, yeah, you know, that's another whole story. But on those basic questions during the nationalist movement, he was terrific, and he was unflagging in the work he did. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Shanti, please.
Professor Metcalf, thank you so much. I'm in awe of your knowledge and your passion for the subject. I'm a Hindu, but I've always been drawn to the Muslim culture and the Muslim literature. My question to you is, what drew you in the first place to the study of South Asian, especially the Islam and Muslim culture? Thank you.
You know, I actually am a firm believer in life that we do things and then rationalize them afterward. So, but I think probably what happened was I always wanted to study or teach history. And I was very drawn to British history. And although I don't believe it is reflected in the work I've produced, I think for many bookish girls, there's a real Anglophilia because you read books, English children's books, right? So I'm kind of drawn to that. But anyway, as I got more involved, I shifted my interest from British history to British Empire, and from British Empire to India, the most important part. Now, when it came to Muslims, I don't know. I mean, one retrospective angle is that I'm a product, as Muslim said, of the 60s. And in Muslims, you do have such a dramatic parallel to the civil rights kinds of issues of African Americans in this country. The more you look at it, I mean, the easy comparison is African Americans and Dalits, and there are real issues there. But the role that Muslims play in Indian nationalism is so parallel to the role African Americans have been forced into in forging what now we recognize as kind of white supremacist majoritarian nationalism in our country.
Thank you. Dr. Nazir Ahmad. Nazir Saab, unmute, please.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this very fascinating and illuminating presentation. Reform has always been a recurrent theme in Indian Islam. and a source of tension between tradition, tasawwuf, and reform. And if I may point out to the so-called court-martial of Chiragh Delhi in the magnificent court of Ghiyasuddin Taghlaq in the year 1330 in the old city of Delhi, wherein the issue of sama, the introduction of music, was discussed. And you're well aware of it. The Mutazilites, or the rationalites, are pitted against the Ahl Hadith and against Chiragh Delhi. In any case, at that time, the study of Hadith was not such a strong discipline in the subcontinent. So much so that the kings had to go out and import people such as Ibn Battuta and so on to come and introduce it. Now, in your presentation, you rightly point out that by the 19th century, Indian Islam had come to occupy a central position in the study of Hadith. How did this transformation happen from being so weak in the study of Hadith to being so strong in the study of Hadith?
Well, thank you first for your contribution, your historical anecdote, which is a very interesting one. And that question, that is, I don't know. I mean, we can point to figures who were critical. What is it here that has encouraged, what is it in the Indian context that makes Hadith so important, so central? And certainly by the late 19th century into the 20th century, competition over devotion to the Prophet core in sectarian tensions, because I think that's part of it. I think I don't have an explanation. Do you have one?
Well, the study of Hadith has to be looked at in the context of understanding the seerah of the Prophet. There's also the internal tension between the way people look at the seerah of the Prophet, the sciences of Hadith, and the Sunnah of the Prophet. So we have the stream of Sunnah, the stream of Hadith, and the stream of seerah. The modernists place emphasis on the seerah, the methodology of the Prophet.
Right.
The Ahl Tasawwuf, they place emphasis on the Sunnah of the Prophet. Whereas in the 18th century, especially in the 18th century, with the advent of Wahhabism in the latter part of the 17th century and so on, it was a global movement. It was not just in India, Saudi Arabia, Western Africa, and of course, India too. A shift somehow to the right. And the shift had in its downdraft a pull towards what the Prophet said rather than what he did or his methodology. So it was not just India. If we look at Ottoman Empire and Usman Dan Fodio in Nigeria about the same time, it is a global shift. I don't know why it happened, but it started with Aurangzeb and continued. It continues to this day.
But you said a lot in that. And I'll just pick up on 2 points. One is the whole question of prophetic biography and this focus on the being, on the love of the Prophet and on his life has absolutely exploded from the late 19th century on. With more biographies of the Prophet written in those decades that began there than in all of Islamic history preceding. So that in itself is fascinating. I think that this book, Jalal's book, is one, if you haven't bumped into, you would find very interesting for 2 reasons. One is he really challenges the notion that we can generalize as a Wahhabi phenomenon. He sees the Wahhabis, the Arabians Wahhabis, as absolute outliers as very different from the West African, North African, Yemeni, Indian kinds of reform of the 18th century. So that, not least in that he sees all of the others as critics of existing political regimes, not as allies, as the Wahhabis become. And so Sadiq Hassan Khan was very judgmental about the aristocrats of his day, about their exploitation, about the way governments were run. He wasn't only talking about Hadith, so that's important. And also, he is unique in the virulence with which he pronounced takfir. He alone stands out as the one who is defining people outside the world of Islam. So that's an interesting thing. So those are just two comments on your very, very interesting points.
I have a question.
Okay, hold on, Razibai, you will be the last, as usual. So the next person is Nawab Siddiqui, and that will be the last question. And then Razibai will wrap up with this question.
So
go ahead, Nawab Siddiqui Saab.
All right. My question to you is why British were successful in India, even with these Muslim scholars?
They had power.
No, there's something else also.
Yeah, I beyond that, it's hard for me to say. They did have extraordinary power. They found, the key is that they found Indian allies who threw their lot in with them. And once they had people who saw their interests tied up with British interests, whether it is at the level of the sepoy or at the level of aristocrats, that made all the difference. They were extremely good at finding people who saw their own interests served. But it is critical that the British were an extraordinary military and sea power. And the marvelous, actually, this is funny. It was, what is his name? Now I'm just drawing a blank. Novelist. I saw him do a talk with a map of where the British had military installations in the world in the 19th century. And it is unbelievable. I mean, it's like we Americans barely know how many places around the world we have soldiers, or whatever, military bases, but it was the same kind of thing here. So I think it is, as I think it was Muslim jumped in, that question of a particular kind of power and the ability to create alliances in a country that did not have a sense of itself as a distinctive polity, as countries didn't in the 18th century. Most of them.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Razi Bhai.
Yeah, all right. So
Back to you.
Okay, my question is, what was the root cause between this tension, like how the British were so much helpless in not getting the Deobandi, Deoband school or Deobandi scholars into their fold? Is this like, had it been like if they also were part of them, or at least in good relationship, perhaps that could have avoided a partition, because Deoband's influence on the nationalist Muslim was so enormous that carried a big problem for the, within the Muslim community, like, in nationalist Muslim versus Muslim League Muslims. And is there some fundamental problem between British administration and the Deobandi scholars that they really didn't get along, while other scholars got along with the British? What was the core issue?
That again is a very good question. When we come, in a sense, what the Deobandis had was a modus vivendi.
Yeah.
They recognized that there was no option other than the British. But all I can say is, how could they not have been caught up in what drew so many people into the nationalist movement, which crystallized in World War I, when you felt betrayed by the British on every front, right? That there were promises made of all kinds, promise that Muslim soldiers, who were a huge component in this army throughout the Middle East and in Europe, would not fight against the Ottomans. They went against that. That India would have much more devolution of power. What they in fact was given was trivial. There was not a quick movement to Commonwealth status. It wasn't called that, but Dominion status at all. And most important, the British were exercising incredible brutality in places like Jallianwala Bagh. So I guess I would mostly say, they could not have stood apart from those kinds of disappointments and failures on the part of the British.
But at the same time, that became a problem within the community also. Had they not seen that there is another very forceful movement like Muslim League, they are opting for a Muslim land. So Deoband being the seminary, the foremost seminary in the subcontinent, most influential, had they no idea or no dream about a Muslim land, or what was the division within the Muslims that they couldn't come.
I think the opposition to the notion of a Muslim land is what I just described, the realism of Hussein Mcmudney. I mean, he, after all, had roots, even though he had been in Medina, in UP, where how would you operate? I mean, he has this very eloquent passage. How would you operate? I'm a Muslim. How could I operate without Hindus? This is my Hindu friend who does this. This is my Hindu purveyor who provides me with this. This is my, this is our life. We are enmeshed with each other. We are not in a place that could become a consolidated country. In the 20th century, polities are defined by geographic area, right? And he knew, as I haven't read the chats, but I think somebody pointed out, after all, India winds up with what, the second largest Muslim population, maybe the third, I don't know, whatever, in the world, despite Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? How do you extract that? And he traveled. I think, many of the Deobandis had extremely extensive networks. Either they traveled themselves or someone like Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanvi. Because of the train, Tanimbaban, one of these country towns, was on the train line. Hundreds of his disciples came by train to sit in his presence, even if for a short period. So they knew that there were Muslims all over the country, embedded in complicated societies. Yeah.
All right. Well,
I can see you're not satisfied.
No, that's okay. I mean, it is, well, we have to learn and constantly get whatever. But it is a fascinating, story also, Deoband alone and holding the ground and, the whole movement of Jamaat Ulama, and then the differences between the two, within the community, and, dream for a secular or a composite land and all those. There's a lot to learn and a lot to think about. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for quite revealing a talk, and then that so many questions came. We enjoyed.
Thank you for having me. Thank you again, Wazam, for being here and for the introduction.
Yeah, we learned a lot, and hopefully, thank you very much.